Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
A husband pulling up to his and his wife's house saw an unfamiliar car next to the house, and soon two men for them too. Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. When I opened the door to the tavern, the sound that poured out was reminiscent of a crowd at a sporting event. I'm pretty sure I know what game they're playing there, I thought ironically. As I walked inside, I noticed that the noise had died down, but I ignored the attention and looked around the room until I saw Marge waving at me from a table she had grabbed. Approaching her, the noise gradually returned to its previous level. She stood up when I approached. Not knowing how to greet her, I clumsily extended my hand to shake, but she ignored it and hugged me, like women do. This simple gesture filled me with warmth. Among the secretaries in the executive department, who generally treated me coldly, Marge, as the secretary to the president of Magnet Inn, was something of a queen among the other ladies. So asking her out for drinks was a big deal. "I'm glad you could come, Jessica," she said as we both sat down. "I wanted to get to know you better." "I really appreciate the invitation, Marge," I said. "My friends call me Jess." At this moment, a cheerful waitress came to take our order. Marge ordered a beer, then raised her eyebrows slightly when I ordered a wine cocktail but didn't comment. "I really appreciate your invitation, Marge," I told her sincerely. "It wasn't that easy to get a job at Magna, so it means a lot to me that you're interested in me. Some of the other ladies don't seem to like me very much." She put her hand on mine. "It's not that they don't like you, Jess. It's just that you're new, and Mary, the woman you replaced, was with us for many years before she retired." "I guess I can understand that," I said. "And to be honest," Marge continued, "it's also about your appearance, I guess. Some of them are a little intimidated because you're so beautiful." "Please don't say that, Marge," I interrupted. "I don't want to appear falsely modest." I hastened to say when she raised her eyebrows again, "But I'm not a real beauty. I could never get a job as a top model." She looked at me skeptically. "I'm not sure about that," she said. "But be that as it may, most of us would kill to have looks like yours, and it inevitably leads to some envy." I shook my head. "They wouldn't be so jealous if they knew how my appearance affected my life. For many reasons, beauty is a curse, not an asset." Now she clearly didn't believe me. "Each of these girls spends a fortune on clothes, hairdressers, and makeup trying to look like your natural self. We are cursed, not you." I shook my head again. "You may think so, but you are wrong. For example, I walk with my eyes down on the ground like one of the untouchables in India. I don't dare look up for fear of meeting a man's eyes because if that happens, he'll probably flirt with me." "Is it that bad?" Marge asked, smiling. "Yes," I said firmly. "When it happens, almost all the time, the men who approach me are so nasty or annoying." "Come on," said Marge. "There must be some good guys among them." "You would be surprised," I told her. "In my experience, the nice guys are either too polite, or they think I'm out of their league and don't even try. Mostly, only the nasty types make moves. I can't believe a woman who looks like you doesn't attract the attention of handsome men." "What about them?" "In their own way, Marge, they are no better, if not worse. The people I've dated think they are God's gift to women, that I should enjoy just being around them. What's worse is that they'll abandon you in a heartbeat for the next pretty face that appears on the horizon." At this point, the waitress reappeared and placed another wine cocktail in front of me. "I didn't order this," I said, puzzled. "I know," said the waitress. "That guy asked me to bring this," she said, pointing over my shoulder. I should have known better, but I still looked in that direction, only to see a big businessman heading towards me. He grabbed an empty chair from a nearby table and, nodding to Marge, sat down opposite me. "Hi, my name is Al," he said. "You look like you need some company." I sighed. "Sorry, Al," I said politely, "but I already have company. My friend and I just want to have a quiet conversation alone." He didn't even turn his plump face towards Marge. "Ah, that doesn't sound like much fun. Look, let's have a couple of drinks together, and then we'll go somewhere where we can find more entertainment." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not interested." "Come on, baby," he said, grabbing my hand in his sweaty palm. "You'll have more fun with me than with her." I looked at Marge with an "I told you so" expression, then turned to the busybody. "How long have you been here in this country?" I asked him indifferently. He looked at me with bewilderment. "What?" "I never moved here. I was born in America." "And yet, you still haven't learned the meaning of the word no," I said ironically. Marge laughed loudly, and the guy's face became even redder. He stood up so abruptly that he overturned his chair. Picking it up hastily, he turned and walked away. As we left, we heard him muttering obscenities. I turned to Marge. "Do you believe me now?" "Wow, that was pretty annoying," she said, still giggling at the guy's quick departure. "And this, despite the fact that I didn't do anything for it," I continued. "You can imagine what would have happened if I had given at least some positive signals. And it's not just looks, I have to be careful about what I wear too. If I don't want that kind of attention, I have to choose my clothes carefully so I don't accidentally show too much skin." Marge started to answer, but I insisted, "One more thing. I noticed your reaction when I ordered a wine cocktail. But I always have to be careful with how much I drink. I can't afford to relax in social situations and need to be constantly on guard to avoid attracting unwanted attention. It's like I told you, looking like me is like being on probation. One little mistake and I'm in trouble again." Suddenly, Marge's eyes lit up. "Wait a minute, were you harassed at work too?" I winked at her. "Riley often," I said. She looked shocked. "Is it really Tom Moffat?" she asked with concern. "Oh no," I hastened to say. "My boss is a really nice person. He treats me more like a granddaughter than an employee. I never had any problems with him." She looked relieved for a moment, then her eyes narrowed. "What about the silver-bearded wonder?" I laughed. As VP of Sales and Marketing, my boss had two subordinates. Scott Benson, the sales director, was a divorced man in his late 30s with a prematurely gray beard and mustache. People in the office said he was a genius. They also said he was a real ladies' man. Marge grinned. "He hit on you the first day." "And every day after that," I continued, and she burst out laughing. "What about Peter?" she asked curiously. Peter Hamill, the marketing director, was Mr. Moffat's other direct report. "He didn't hit on me directly," I admitted, "but he looks at me appraisingly when he thinks I'm not noticing." "Well, he better not do that. He's married," she said. "Is there anyone else?" she asked. I nodded. "Except for my boss, almost all of them." This caused another giggle from her. Then she continued, "So, do you have someone in your life now?" "No, I'm almost out of the dating game," I told her. "That's pretty hard to believe," Marge said incredulously. Then her eyes narrowed a little. "Has there ever been a serious man in your life?" The pain in my palms made me realize how tightly I had clenched my fists. "There was one, but it's a pretty painful story. Let's better leave this for another time, okay?" Marge nodded sympathetically, and we moved on to other less sensitive topics. When we left the tavern and I headed home, I felt like I had won a friend. I hope so. I don't have many friends. As I drove, I was glad that Marge didn't ask me about the women in the office. Several of them also flirted with me. The point is that men can be crude, even if they are predictable. Women are worse. They pretend to like you and then tear you apart behind your back out of envy or jealousy. They can be incredibly mean, and I have been emotionally scarred on more than one occasion. The following week, while I was working on some correspondence that Mr. Moffat had left me, Peter Hamill came to my desk. He waited until I finished typing the sentence and then asked if I could spare him a few minutes. "I have a big favor to ask," he said. I immediately became wary, wondering if Peter was about to start something. But when he pulled a chair up to my desk and started talking, he surprised me. "Do you know Karen Scott's secretary?" he asked. "I've met her," I replied, "but I can't say that I know her well. She was young, sweet, neighborly, attractive, and as far as I could tell, quite smart." "Why do you ask?" "The thing is, Scott is very angry with her because she was a little late on the report he wanted, and I'm afraid he's going to fire her." This was quite consistent with my expectations. In the short time I worked at Magnet, Scott's department probably had more turnover than any other department in the company. He was a perfectionist, and when one of his team members did not live up to his impossible standards, he seemed to delight in pointing out their shortcomings, usually doing so in front of everyone. He had fired quite a few people, and some had either transferred or left, but senior management seemed to turn a blind eye to his inability to manage people, probably because of his sales performance. I assume, Peter continued, that you can do something to help her keep her job. Suddenly, a light bulb went on in my head, and I realized what was happening. Are you sleeping with her? I exclaimed. He recoiled in surprise. What? No, of course not. She's married, and so am I. I looked at him coldly. Being married doesn't stop a lot of guys from having fun on the side. But if you're not sleeping with her, why do you want to help Scott's secretary? Peter was wary but nevertheless continued his mission. I guess I feel responsible for her. I'm the one who hired her. She was smart and enthusiastic, and I thought she had a lot of potential, and still do. When Scott was promoted to director of sales, I recommended her to take over as his secretary. It was a good promotion for her, and I thought she would do a good job. I probably didn't take into account how Scott is with people. The point is, I feel guilty for putting her in his way, and I'd like to save her if I can. I looked at him carefully while he told his story. He didn't seem like the type to hide anything, but some men can be very sneaky, especially when it comes to intim. So, what exactly do you want me to do? I asked. He looked at me seriously. I was hoping that maybe she could help you with some work while Scott is away on business this week. Then, if you could write him a note complimenting her, with a copy to Mr. Moffat, Scott would have a hard time sacking her for incompetence. As far as I knew, Scott, Peter's plan probably would have worked. Scott was someone who never missed an opportunity to suck up to his bosses. I turned my attention back to Peter. I was still not sure of his true motives, so I decided to retreat for a while. You know what, Peter? Ask Karen to have lunch with me today. After talking to her, I will decide if I can help her. He got up. Okay, Jess. Thanks, he said. I'll talk to her right away. He turned to leave, then turned around. I really hope you can help her. She's a good girl and deserves better. 15 minutes later, Karen called me, and we agreed to meet for lunch. I hoped she would feel freer to speak outside of work. When we arrived at the restaurant, at first it seemed to me that I might have made a mistake. The waiter circled around us for what seemed like an eternity, trying to strike up a conversation, but he finally brought our order and left, giving Karen and me a chance to talk. I looked at her sternly. I want you to be honest with me, Karen. Are you and Peter having an affair? She sighed in surprise. Oh no, what made you think that? I ignored her question. Well, was he hitting on you? Do you think he's trying to start something with you? Now she was outraged. Of course not. I don't think he's that kind of person. And even if he were, I'm happily married and Peter knows it. He even dated my husband. Watching and listening to her, I really didn't think Karen was hiding anything. Nevertheless, okay, I said, but I still can't understand why he goes to such lengths to try to protect you. She shrugged. I'm not entirely sure either. Most bosses wouldn't. I think Peter is just a kind person. Either way, I'm very grateful. Her answer didn't sound rote. Maybe Peter's request really was nothing more than it seemed. Either way, I didn't want the woman sitting in front of me to suffer because of someone like Scott Benson. Okay, Karen, here's what we'll do, I said, and her eyes sparkled with gratitude as I outlined the plan. A week later, I had just hung up when I saw Peter standing next to me. I could tell he was looking at me because he quickly looked away when I looked up. What do you need, Peter? I asked. I just wanted to stop and thank you for helping Karen, he said. I was in Scott's office talking about the expo and noticed your note on his desk. I really appreciate you finding some executive cover for her. I smiled at him. I was glad to help. Karen really seems like a great prospect, and it would be a shame if the company lost her. He nodded and started to walk away, but I felt a little guilty for doubting him earlier, so I quickly spoke up. To be honest, I'm impressed that you would take such a risk for someone who doesn't even work for you." He actually blushed. "Well, it wasn't any more than anyone else would do." I nodded. "But in my experience, people don't go out of their way to help others if they don't expect anything in return." It was nice to know that there are exceptions. "I'm still impressed," I told him. He started to walk away again but then turned around. "Listen, I was going to go to the cafeteria to get something to eat. Would you like to join?" Normally, I would have turned down such an offer, but Peter seemed like a really nice person, and I thought it couldn't hurt to make another friend. "Of course, it will be great." Over lunch, I learned a lot about Peter Hamill. The first thing was that he was devoted to his wife. "See, she's an interior designer and a damn good one," he told me. He took out his cell phone and started showing me pictures of her and some of the spaces she had decorated. "She even worked for some of our leaders," he said proudly. But before he could continue, we were interrupted by one of his colleagues who needed a solution from Peter on the issue of promotional materials for the expo. While Peter was dealing with this issue, another team member came to our table with another work issue. Soon, a small team meeting gathered at our table. Peter turned and made gestures of apology, but I waved my hand and urged him to continue. Then, I sat quietly, watching him interact with his team. When they asked him questions, he always took the time to listen to them and then ask questions of his own, often getting answers from them. It was also telling for me to see how his team felt comfortable communicating with him. They respected his opinion but clearly did not feel intimidated or subservient. When I finally left, I had a much clearer picture of Peter. Very interesting, I thought. It's nice to see someone in a leadership position who doesn't act like a jerk. That evening, Marge came to my table to invite me back to the tavern. I was glad to receive a second invitation and accepted it with pleasure. Once her beer and my wine cocktail were delivered, she leaned on the table and looked at me intently. "I saw you had lunch with Peter today. Is there something going on between you two that I should know about?" "Not at all," I said hastily. "He came by to run some errands just before lunch, so it was only natural that we went to the dining room together." I was glad because it gave me the opportunity to get to know him better. Marge looked at me expectantly. "And what did you find out?" Seeing that Marge was waiting, I continued. "I found out that he seems like a really good person. He also seems to be a good leader who is respected by the people he works with." When Marge was expecting more, I continued. "And I learned that he is happily married and loves and admires his wife," I said firmly. Marge tilted her head and asked, "Is that all?" I sighed. "Listen, Marge, I already said that I'm not looking for male company right now. Even if I were, I would not become a destroyer of families," I said decisively. She looked at me carefully, and her expression became more sympathetic. "Someone offended you very badly, didn't they? Do you want to talk about it?" I was about to deny it, but suddenly something inside me gave way, and to my surprise, I heard myself begin to pour out the whole ugly story. I met Mr. Wright during my senior year of college. In fact, he probably found me, but be that as it may, I immediately realized that he was the one. We got married shortly after graduation and began our life together as the American dream should be. He was proud of my appearance and loved to go out where he could show me off. I was a little uncomfortable with it at first, but he liked it so much that I was happy to do it. Even when he started asking me to wear more revealing clothes, I was willing to do it for his pleasure. I paused to take a sip of my drink. Before I met him, I was not very intimately active. I guess I didn't want to get the reputation of being easy. Anyway, after we got married, our nightlife was really good, at least for me. But my husband was not satisfied. A couple of years later, he proposed the idea of role-playing games. At first, I was offended because I thought it meant he was unhappy with me, but I soon realized that what he really wanted was for me to fantasize about other men when we were in bed together. I tried to explain that I couldn't separate love from intim, but he kept insisting. So eventually, I started pretending he was Brad Pitt. "Good choice," Marge intervened. "He's a really handsome guy." I looked at her with irritation, and she fell silent. This satisfied him for a while, but soon, the film actor stopped suiting him. Then he wanted me to talk about my ex-boyfriends and then about other men we knew. I felt really uncomfortable fantasizing about real people, but he insisted, and I went along with it for his sake. Then he began a new phase where he took me to nightclubs and bars and encouraged me to interact with other men. He wanted me to let them buy me drinks and dance with me. After that, he asked me which of them seemed attractive to me and whether I would like to date them if I were free. When I finally admitted that some of them actually seemed attractive, it seemed to turn him on. He became very agitated, and for a while, I enjoyed all the extra attention he was giving me in bed. But when he asked me if I would actually date someone for real, I was hurt and confused. I told him that he was the only man I wanted and that giving up everyone else meant a lot to me. He retreated for a while but soon returned to his own asking leading questions, making insidious comments. Finally, he told me that if I really loved him, I should actually sleep with another man. Why did he do this? Marge asked, shaking her head in shock. Was he looking for an excuse to see other women? I asked myself the same question, I said, but he swore he wasn't interested in anyone else. He said that he wanted to see me from the outside, to observe how I behave in a fit of passion. He kept saying how much I would love it and how he wanted to make me happy. I told him that the only thing that would make me happy is if he forgot about all this madness. But he didn't forget, did he? Marge asked. No, he didn't, I said. I came home one Friday and saw an unfamiliar car parked in front of our house. When I walked in, my husband was talking to two very large men. He introduced them to me and then stunned me. These guys have incredible assets, he blurted out. They'll keep you entertained all night. You'll love it. I paused to wipe away the tears running down my cheeks. Marge, I couldn't believe it. All my life, men had treated me like a piece of meat, and now my husband, the man I loved and trusted, was doing the same. He wanted to give me away to two men I didn't even know, just for his own selfish gratification. He didn't care about my feelings, my desires. He wanted to use my body for his pleasure, like everyone else. It felt like betrayal to the highest degree. Anyway, I made an excuse, snuck out of the house, went straight to my parents, and never came back. After the divorce, I decided to leave the city so as not to risk meeting him again. That's how I ended up here. Marge reached out to take my hand. I'm so sorry, Jess. This must be terrible for you. You know what's the worst thing about this? I continued. While he was telling me what the men were going to do to me that evening, I looked around the room and noticed boxes filled with lighting equipment and video cameras. They were going to film the whole thing. I probably would have ended up on some website if I had done what he wanted. Marge's face turned pale. This is simply incredible. I was crying now and couldn't stop. The most annoying thing is that I always think about what I did wrong. What did I do to make him see me like this? What could I have done differently to save our marriage? I feel like such a failure. She squeezed my hand gently. Jess, you can't blame yourself. There was nothing you did to cause it, and there was nothing you could have done to prevent it. It was your ex's problem, not yours. Maybe, I said, but I still feel it. Anyway, now you understand why I'm not very interested in men. As I sat there, wiping my face, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a man approaching our table with 2 drinks in his hands. But when he saw the tears running down my cheeks, he turned around and walked back to the bar. Marge must have seen it too because she grinned. Well, at least one good thing that comes out of this is that it looks like you found an effective way to repel unwanted advances. I smiled through my tears. As we left the tavern, Marge held me up until we got to my car. She then hugged me tightly and said, "Hang in there, Jess. Everything will be all right." I hoped she was right. The next couple of weeks at work were crazy as we got closer to the expo. This was a critical event for Magnadin. The company was launching its new line of components at the exhibition and was counting on large orders. A successful exhibition would set the tone for the whole year. Failure could have serious consequences. Adding to the turmoil, word spread around the office that my boss, Mr. Moffat, was about to announce his retirement. I doubted it. I had not heard or seen anything from him that would indicate this. The second part of the rumor was that either Peter or Scott would be chosen to succeed Mr. Moffat as vice president. This really caused a stir, dividing the office into 3 camps, There were those who supported Scott, hoping to benefit from his promotion. The second group, of course, consisted of those who were loyal to Peter and believed that he should be chosen. The third was the anyone but Scott group, those who were horrified by Scott's arrogance and feared that life would become unbearable if he took over the company. The result was chaos, with a lot of irritated people exacerbated by tight deadlines. In all this confusion, Mr. Moffat called me into his office early one afternoon with an urgent request. Scott had given him some information about expo pricing for his reference, and now Mr. Moffat wanted Scott to see his comments. But when I called Scott's cell phone, I found out that he was working from home. He invited me to bring the materials to his home. I didn't like being a messenger, and it was suspicious that Scott wanted me to come to his house, but Mr. Moffat needed a quick answer. So, I pulled out of the parking lot and entered the address of Scott's house into the GPS. Scott's house was on a cul-de-sac in the kind of neighborhood I would expect for an ambitious executive. I parked in front of the house and carried the package of documents to the front door. But when I rang the doorbell, no one answered. This surprised me, and I tried to look through the windows to see if anyone was home. Then I checked around the house, but still didn't see anyone. I took out my cell phone to call him, but before I could make the call, I thought I heard voices from behind the house. I hesitated but eventually walked around to the back of the house. It quickly became clear that the voices were coming from the screened-in porch at the back of the house. As I approached, my steps slowed down because I heard something strange in those sounds. Carefully looking around the corner, I recoiled in surprise and embarrassment. The sounds I heard were Scott having a night with some woman. I stood there, paralyzed by uncertainty. In this situation, I was unlikely to make my presence known, but I still needed to deliver materials for Scott to review. Then, while I was hesitating, I heard a woman's sounds, and I have to admit that maybe curiosity got the better of me. It had been so long since I had an intimate that the sights and sounds of this unexpected encounter completely overcame my common sense. I realized that I was still holding my cell phone in my hand, and without really knowing what I was doing, I picked it up and started taking a video of the scene unfolding in front of me. Sometimes she would lean in to kiss him, and I thought to myself, she's really into Scott. Honestly, it made me a little jealous. Why couldn't I have someone I was crazy about? Scott had been mostly quiet up until this point, but suddenly he started talking to the brunette, goading her with his words. I felt a chill but told myself it might just be a coincidence. "Oh God, Scott," the woman responded enthusiastically. "He doesn't even come close. He never made me feel the way you do." She was making so much noise that I was afraid Scott's neighbors would hear her and see me peeping, so I hurried back to the front of the house. I quickly hid the papers inside Scott's screen door and then ran to my car. When I left, I was so shocked that my hands were shaking. "Oh God, what should I do now?" I asked myself. I can't tell Peter. He would be horrified to find out that his wife was cheating on him, and with Scott of all people. But I have to tell him. I can't hide this from him. When I returned to the office, I hurried to my desk and tried to keep myself busy with work, but all I could think about was Scott and Peter's wife having an affair, mocking poor Peter. The memory of that made me feel sick. He's a good guy and handsome too. Why is she cheating on him? I continued to ask myself. Finally, as the day came to an end, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone and made the call I really didn't want to make. "Peter, this is Jess. Will you be in the office for a while longer?" "Oh yeah, I'll probably be working late every day until the expo," he replied cheerfully. "Come in whenever it's convenient for you," he said happily. I cringed. I knew that he would not be so cheerful after our conversation. Walking into Peter's office was like going into surgery. You know you have to go, but every cell in your body is screaming at you to run in the opposite direction. When I arrived, Peter greeted me with a cheerful wave, but when he saw my expression, he sat up in his chair, a look of concern crossing his face. "What happened, Jess? What's wrong?" I sat down heavily in one of the chairs at his desk. "I have bad news, Peter. I don't want to be the one to pass it on, but I just have no choice." "It's okay," he said gently. "You can tell me." I couldn't look him in the eye. "Mr. Moffat asked me to take some documents to Scott's house this afternoon. When I arrived, no one answered the doorbell, so I walked around the house and heard a noise. When I looked out onto his screened-in porch, this is what I saw. With that, I turned on the video I had taken on my phone and handed it to Peter. When he saw Scott crouched next to the woman lying on the lounge chair, he let out a bitter laugh. "So this is what Scott calls working from home," he said disdainfully. I can't say I'm surprised. He was about to give me the phone back, but I pushed it back towards him. "Look further," I said in a quiet, pained voice. I knew he recognized his wife because Peter's face looked like he'd been stabbed with a knife. I couldn't help myself. I started crying. It's terrible to see how a person's illusions are destroyed before their eyes. His face showed shock, pain, and anger all at once as he sat there in agony. I quickly reached over to try to take my phone out of his hands because I didn't want him to hear what came next, but he didn't let go of the phone. "There's something else, isn't there?" he asked in a tense voice. "You shouldn't watch this, Peter," I said, but I knew that wouldn't stop him. Then we heard Peter's wife talk about how good Scott is and how she enjoys cheating on her husband behind his back. Peter's face went pale. I silently prayed that I would never see someone humiliated like that again. Finally, the video ended, and Peter sank into his chair. After a short pause, he raised his head to look at me with tired eyes. "You know what amazed me most? It's not that she cheated on me, this is bad enough. They didn't just have a night, they made love." I desperately tried to find words that could ease his pain, but nothing came to mind. All I could do was repeat, "I'm so sorry, Peter. I'm so sorry," as he hung his head in despair. Something suddenly cleared inside me, and I exclaimed louder than I intended. I just realized, Peter. Scott must have wanted me to see him with her. He specifically asked Mr. Moffat for me to deliver these documents. He wanted me to hear and see them together. He wanted to humiliate me and force me to tell you. He's always hated me, and this is his way of getting back at me. "But why?" I asked. "I understand that you are both competitors, but why is he so angry?" Peter sighed heavily. "Before you came to Magnet Inn," Scott reported to me, "I thought he was talented, although impulsive. I even saved his job one day when he became overprotective about an expense report he filed. Audit asked a routine question about this, and Scott lost his temper. He wrote a defiant note to the head of audit that essentially said, 'How dare you ask me? Go to hell.' Scott sent a copy to me, and I was able to stop it before delivery to the VP of audit. Then I calmed Scott down, got him to delete the note, and the whole thing disappeared as far as I knew. Sometime later, a sales director position became available, and I recommended Scott for the position." I shook my head in disbelief. "Wait a minute, are you saying Scott hates you because you recommended him for a promotion? I would have thought that he would be forever grateful to you." Peter shook his head. "In your world and mine, it would be so. But in Scott's world, no one is considered smarter than him, and the idea that he owes something to someone is alien to him. You could say he never forgave me for putting him in debt to me." Now it was my turn to shake my head. "But I still don't understand why he risked revealing his connection. Wouldn't that get him in trouble at Magnet?" Peter's voice was cold and bitter. "Not really. The company will see this as a private matter between C and Scott. They won't want to interfere. No, I think the reason Scott wanted me to find out was to provoke me into doing something stupid that would get me fired. Even if I don't do anything, he's probably hoping that I'll be so humiliated here in the office that my job will suffer while I'm busy with a messy divorce." He looked at me carefully. "And I think he decided to use you as an intermediary as revenge for you resisting his advances." My cheeks turned red, first from embarrassment and then from anger. But while I resented Scott taking advantage of me, I was more bothered by Peter. The tone of his voice made me uneasy. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. He clenched his fists tightly for a moment, then relaxed. "For now, I'm not going to do anything other than focus on preparing for the expo. I definitely can't afford to lose my job now. But as soon as this is over, rest assured I will divorce C and find a way to pay Scott back. Peter, I have experienced betrayal in my life, so I can understand some of what you are feeling right now. If there is anything I can do to help, please let me know. But whatever you decide, don't do anything that will end up hurting you," I said. "Thank you, Jess," he said quietly. "I appreciate it, and I appreciate the courage you had to show to bring this to me. The only thing I ask now is that you don't tell anyone else what you found out. And I'm just going to drown my pain in work. This is the only thing I know how to help myself cope with the pain." He looked at me with a grin. "It will also give me a reason to stay away from C." I glanced at him as I turned to leave and felt as if my heart was breaking. It was terrible to see how a good, decent man suddenly found himself under the rubble of his life. There were only a few working days left until the start of the expo, and tensions seemed to only increase with each passing day. Some of this tension, of course, was simply a reaction to the timing associated with such a large undertaking, but this time there was also animosity between the marketing and sales departments that seemed to infect almost everyone on both teams. Fueling the fire were rumors about Mr. Mate. Not only were discussions around the water cooler suggesting that his retirement was in the offing, but now the story was spreading that Scott Benson would be his successor. As a result, the people on Scott's team became even more sycophantic, trying to gain Scott's favor, while the people working with Peter were upset and worried about the prospect of corporate life under Scott's leadership. I became something of an unofficial member of Peter's group and regularly offered to help them where I could. The first few times I sat down at the dinner table with them, I received some questioning looks, but with Peter's clear approval, they accepted me. As a result, they were not shy about sharing their opinions with me about what was happening. The fervor of their treatment of Scott was almost shocking. "If he gets the VP job, it will be a disaster for the company," was a common theme. "Why would senior management even consider promoting such a terrible boss?" was another question. It was alarming to hear qualified, capable people considering leaving the company if Scott were promoted to vice president. On the other hand, their respect for Peter was as high as their opinion of Scott was low. Several times when Peter was not around, one of his employees volunteered to tell a story about how Peter helped solve a problem. He had the ability to offer constructive suggestions that would motivate a person to come back and do a better job. It seemed obvious to me what the company had to do, but I knew that managers often focus solely on short-term profits and do not see what will be best in the long term. If the tension in his group was high, then it was obvious that Peter was on edge. The combination of the deadline, competition with Scott, and revelations about C was almost unbearable. I was afraid that something was going to break. So, concerned about his condition, 2 days before the start of the expo, I went into Peter's office. Although it was already well after working hours, I was sure that I would find him there, and I was not mistaken. He was surrounded by a small group of his key staff, intently studying something on his computer screen. I didn't want to interrupt him, so I stopped at the door to watch him carefully. I knew he was tired from the long hours he spent there, but the lines and dark shadows on his face betrayed an additional burden that only I knew about. It bothered me, but I couldn't think of anything I could do to help. Suddenly, he raised his head and noticed me. "Hey, Jess," he said. "Come on in and look at this," he said, pointing to his monitor. When I walked over and looked over his shoulder, all I saw was a vision of an empty room surrounded by curtains. Okay, I said hesitantly. "What am I watching?" "This is a new system that we are testing. What you are seeing is a live feed from our guest suite at the MGM Grand in Vegas," Peter said proudly. "Look here," he continued, clicking on the keyboard. The view changed to a large hall. As Peter zoomed in, the view narrowed to a large exhibit that was in the process of being installed. "Here is the Magnet Tadine booth at the expo, or there will be as soon as the workers get everything set up," he said. I looked at him in bewilderment. "Why do you need a live broadcast from the expo?" I asked. Instead of answering, Peter pointed to a woman in the group. "Debbie, it was your idea. Tell just what you're up to." She began to speak with delight, like an excited child at an exhibition or a lesson. "This will be great," she began enthusiastically. "This will give us the opportunity to monitor the preparation of the stand in real time and make adjustments if necessary. Once the show starts, this can help us understand what aspects of our stand are attracting customers' attention, be it positive or negative. It will also give employees here at headquarters the opportunity to see what is happening at such an exhibition to understand how their efforts impact overall success." As she spoke, several other team members began pointing out additional uses and possible improvements. Peter turned to me. "We've never done anything like this before, Jess. We'll test it at the expo." If this works as well as we hope, it will give us a new way to improve our marketing efforts at the next major shows. This is really something, I said sincerely. I think Mr. Moffat will be impressed when he sees it. At the mention of Mr. Moffat's name, Debbie snapped her head up with an irritated expression on her face. I wish he'd be impressed enough to recommend Peter over Scott Benson, she exclaimed. She then covered her mouth with her hand in embarrassment when she remembered that I worked for Mr. Moffat. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, she said defensively, but it was clear she meant every word. And although I didn't say anything, I absolutely agreed with her. Debbie's comment seemed to set off a storm of emotions, and others began to voice their thoughts. Peter quickly intervened, trying to ease the tension. We're all a little stressed about what could happen, but it's out of our control. Let's focus on what's our responsibility and let senior management do what they're going to do. One of them exclaimed, yes, but if Scott becomes vice president, life here will turn into hell. That's right, confirmed another. Why can't they see what a terrible leader Scott will be? I watched Peter and saw him raise his head sharply after the last comment. What if they could see? What if they had the opportunity to see the real Peter in action? That would be perfect, someone said, but how could we do this? Peter explained his idea, and the office became a babble of excited voices asking questions and suggesting ideas. I leaned back against the wall and watched their interaction. After some time, their objections formed into a plan, and their excitement turned into determination. When the commotion died down, Peter raised his hand to get their attention. Listen, people, there is something we all need to understand. What we're talking about here may be an eye-opener in the executive office, but it can also backfire horribly on us. Let's agree now that if something goes wrong, I will take all the blame. We must organize this so that no one else is visible in this process. There was an immediate flurry of protests, but Peter remained adamant, and finally, the others reluctantly agreed. I think that while they were loyal to Peter and wanted to support him, deep down, none of them could afford to lose their jobs if their plan failed. But from my point of view, it was commendable that Peter wanted to protect his team even at the risk of his own job. Soon after, Peter ended the meeting and sent everyone home but asked me to stay. When everyone left, he looked at me carefully. Jess, if this crazy scheme is to have any chance of success, you will have to play a key role. We can try to hide your involvement, but there's a good chance someone will find out. Are you sure you want to take the risk? I thought about this, asking myself how I really felt. I knew Scott would be a terrible vice president and that working as his executive assistant would be miserable. I was also disgusted by what Scott did to Peter, and what made it even worse was that Scott was using me to get his message across. These thoughts, mixed with memories of my own failed marriage, only increased my empathy for Peter and my decision to help him. I'm sure, I told Peter firmly. I want to help you as much as I can. Thanks, Jess, he said. It really means a lot to me. The day before the official opening of the expo, Peter and other members of his team flew to Vegas to complete preparations. Once the show gets underway, there will be a constant stream of demos, customer meetings, and visitors checking out Magnet Tadin's huge booth. After the expo started, whenever I had some free minutes, I would go into the control room that Peter's team had set up at headquarters to get the latest news on what was happening. I could sit in front of an extra-large monitor and watch the live feed from the expo floor. I often saw Peter working with our product demonstrators or consulting with some of the people on the installation team. The only time I saw Scott was when the monitor was switched to the guest suite. There, he could often be found chatting with the purchasing executive or senior researcher of one of our clients. As far as I could tell, Scott seemed to be good at his job. Peter's plan did not involve action until the evening of the last day of the expo. He wanted to make sure nothing would interfere with the company's sales efforts. He also wanted to catch Scott off guard when the pressure eased, and he might be less on guard. But for the small group of us who knew about the plan, the tension grew as the deadline approached. Everything was carefully planned and calculated down to the minute. It was nerve-wracking to wait, but there was nothing more we could do. On the last day of the expo, I stayed at my desk, not wanting to get in the way. When my phone finally rang late that afternoon, I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I answered, no one was on the line, and I realized this was my sign to act. I quickly went into Mr. Pat's office to grab his smartphone. My boss had many strengths, but communications technology was not one of them. He rarely used his smartphone and usually left it in the office when he went out of town. I had already checked that he did it this time too. Now, I picked it up and quickly entered the text of the message. As soon as everything was ready, I hurried to the control center that Peter's team had set up. There were still a few steps before I did my job. A large monitor showed the view from the guest room. Scott and his crew wandered around, most with drinks in hand, enjoying the successful conclusion of another big show. Peter was there too, but only a few of his team members were present. We saw Peter check his watch, then look up to where he knew the cameras were and nod. The game had begun. Debbie, the woman I had met earlier in Peter's office, leaned into the microphone in front of the monitor and replied, "Got it. We're ready to launch." It was obvious that Peter heard her through the small microphone in his ear because he nodded again. She flipped a switch and said quietly, "We are starting the first stage." One of Peter's men in the room responded with a secret nod, then walked over to one of Scott's salesmen. He extended his hand to the salesman and began to congratulate him. Even from a distance, we could see a smile spread across the salesman's face. Debbie switched the speaker to a different setting and repeated the same instructions. We watched as one of Peter's product demonstrators walked up to another one of Scott's team and started talking to him. The man's face showed surprise, and although we heard nothing, it was obvious that he was asking for confirmation. Several other members of Peter's team repeated the process, and we could see excitement starting to build within Scott's team. Debbie looked over her shoulder at me, her face tense. "The word is starting to spread," she said. "Get ready." As I watched the screen closely, Peter quietly adjusted something under his jacket, and suddenly, we heard the rustling of fabric as he approached his opponent. "Well, Scott," he said, holding out his hand. "Looks like you've won. Congratulations." "What are you talking about, Peter?" Scott snorted incredulously, not wanting to accept the outstretched hand. "I just heard that Mr. Moffat announced his resignation at the executive committee meeting today." "I also heard that the committee selected you as his successor," Peter said. On the screen, we saw Scott looking at Peter warily. "I didn't hear anything like that." "What game are you playing, Hamill?" At this time, one of his men approached Scott and began patting him on the back. "Well done, boss. We just heard the news." "What news?" "What are you talking about?" The salesman was adamant. "It's all over the show, Scott. You're going to be the new VP of Sales and Marketing." As Scott looked at him uncertainly, another of his men came over to congratulate him. Debbie zoomed in on Scott's face on the screen, and we could clearly see the ecstasy fighting the hesitation. Scott made a small gesture with his hand. Debbie turned to me. "This is your signal," she said. I picked up Mr. Moffat's smartphone and pressed send on the text message I had prepared. I noticed that my hands were a little damp. It was easy to tell when the text went through because Scott flinched as if he had been electrocuted. He quickly pulled his smartphone from his pocket and checked the message he had just received. I knew what he was reading because Peter and I had carefully composed it. "Congratulations, Scott. Today at the executive committee meeting, I announced my resignation. You are replacing me as vice president. We'll talk tomorrow in my office." Moffat. "Yes," Scott shouted, punching the air. "I knew it. I knew it." He pushed his phone at Peter and said, "Read and weep, Hamill." Immediately, more of his men began to gather around Scott, eager to show their loyalty, maneuvering to shake his hand and fawn over him. Someone brought a bottle of champagne and glasses for a toast, while another went to the sound console and switched the music to a loud pop tune. As the alcohol flowed and the impromptu party began to pick up steam, Peter pushed his way back to Scott and handed him back his smartphone. "So, Scott," he asked, "do you have any major changes in mind, or will you continue the course Mr. Moffat has set?" Scott drank his glass of champagne and then leaned towards Peter, his face taking on a menacing expression. "You can be sure there will be changes." Moffat was a corpulent old windbag who couldn't sell a kitten to the French Foreign Legion. "I'm going to change things up, starting with the marketing group. Moffat has tolerated mediocrity for too long. Now I'm going to start clearing away the dead wood, and just in case you haven't figured it out yet, Peter, my philosophy is that the first place to look for rot in a department is at the top. So, you might want to polish up your resume, you know? With that, he pointed his finger at Peter's chest, and for a moment, I lost my breath because I thought Peter was going to hit him and ruin everything. But Peter remained calm and just said, "We'll see, Scott. We'll see." The group surrounding Scott had now pulled him away from the confrontation, and we could clearly hear Scott's voice through the noise. "Come on, guys, it's time to party. All drinks are on me." Peter turned and looked up, facing the cameras hidden there. "Okay," he said quietly. "I think we got exactly what we wanted. Tell all our people to leave the guest room now. I don't want any confrontations." Then he adjusted the microphone, and the sound stopped. At the controls, Debbie gave some quick instructions, and we could see Peter's men quietly leaving the room. When the last of them left, she turned and looked at me with a triumphant expression. "We did it," she exclaimed. "When Moffat and the other executives see this, they'll get a glimpse of the real Scott Benson, and I don't think they'll like it." I wanted to dance. It seemed too good to be true. Yes, there might be questions about how Scott ensured his promotion, but I felt that Mr. Moffat and others would forget them in light of the terrible things Scott had just blurted out. Not only did he directly insult Mr. Moffat, but his attack on the marketing function was an indirect insult too. I knew for sure that Mr. Moffat thought highly of Peter's team and gave him good marks in his annual review. No, I was sure that these comments would determine Scott's fate. Despite the stress we all felt, I couldn't sleep that night and ended up going to work early in the morning. Mr. Moffat always did a debrief after every big event, and I was eager to see how this one went. There was no one in the executive office when I arrived, so I decided to go down to Peter's area to see if anyone from his team was there. But when I arrived in the control room, I was shocked to see Debbie bent over the keyboard, crying her eyes out. Debbie, I asked urgently, "What happened? What's wrong?" She looked up at me with tear-filled eyes and cried, "Everything is lost. Everything is lost." "What's missing?" I asked cautiously. "All the notes from the guest room last night," she said. "I stored everything on the server, and at night, the server crashed. Now everything is gone, and we have no backup. Everything is destroyed." I heard a noise behind me and turned to see Peter entering the room. He had obviously already heard Debbie's words because his face was pale. "What do we do now, Peter?" I asked. He shook his head slowly from side to side. "I don't know what we can do. This could end badly." Then, to my surprise, he straightened up, walked over to Debbie, and began to console her. "It's okay, Deb," he said gently. "It's not your fault. Your system worked flawlessly, and you did a great job coordinating the entire plan. Sometimes bad things just happen. I should have made a backup," she sobbed. "These servers have never given us any trouble." He said soothingly, "No one could have foreseen the failure of the system." He looked at me. "You better go up to your office. If there's any way to apprehend Mr. Moffat, that would be great. I'll try to think of something." I nodded and headed towards the elevator, trying to hold back my tears. Not only did we not have any incriminating material on Scott, but now Peter would have to try to explain why he misled his colleague. Everything that had seemed so perfect just a short time ago now seemed to have turned to ash. When I got off the elevator, I hurried to my desk and tried to compose myself so Mr. Moffat wouldn't see how upset I was. But I needn't have worried. As soon as I was settled, he walked in, and it was immediately obvious that he was extremely angry. "Miss Martin, call Scott Benson's office and have him here immediately," he ordered. With shaking fingers, I dialed Scott's office number and connected with Karen. After I hung up, I looked into Mr. Moffat's office. "His secretary said he hasn't arrived yet," I told him. "She said he was late from Las Vegas last night and hadn't arrived at the office yet." "Well, tell her I want to see him as soon as he comes," he said angrily. "And then call Peter Hamill here." "Yes, sir," I said, trying to control my voice. I called Peter's office, and he answered the phone. "Oh, Peter, Mr. Moffat wants you and Scott to come here as soon as possible," I said, then lowered my voice. "And he's as furious as a hornet's nest," I added. I heard Peter sigh, and then he said sadly, "Okay, Jess. I'll be there now. When Peter walked up to the office, his face was like that of a doomed man. He gave me a weak smile and walked in to meet his fate. Perhaps this will be my fate, I thought, when Mr. Moffat finds out what I've done. The door to Mr. Moffat's office was open so Scott could join the meeting, and I must admit that I eavesdropped, but it was still not easy to hear what was being said over the loud beating of my heart. Usually, Mr. Moffat was a true gentleman, but today there were no formalities. What can you say about the incidents that occurred at the Magnetadine Guest Pavilion last night? He asked Peter. Well, Peter began, after the expo officially ended, we all headed back to the guest pavilion to relax before heading back to our rooms to pack. Then, before Peter could continue, Scott Benson burst into the office looking a little rumpled but with a smug smile on his face. I saw him grin disdainfully at Peter before turning to Mr. Moffat. Sorry I'm late, boss, but yesterday's celebration got out of hand. Mr. Moffat glared at him. And what exactly were you celebrating? He demanded to know. Scott looked at him in confusion. My team wanted to celebrate my promotion to vice president to replace you following your resignation, he said as if Mr. Moffat were a schoolboy. What are you talking about, Benson? I haven't announced any plans to retire. Of course you did, Scott answered boldly. You announced it at the executive committee meeting yesterday. I certainly didn't, Mr. Moffat snapped. There was no discussion of any successor. I looked at Peter out of the corner of my eye. He didn't enjoy Scott's discomfort because he knew where this conversation would inevitably lead. But Scott didn't give up. Of course you did, he said and took out his smartphone and showed it off. I have your text message right here. Mr. Moffat looked at him in astonishment. I didn't send you any text message, he said flatly. Of course you did, Scott insisted, activating his phone. I'll show you. Holding the phone in one hand, he began to call up his text message list with the other. Then he cursed and began frantically scrolling through the list. Finally, he stopped and looked up. It's erased, he said angrily. Someone deliberately erased it. I thought I saw a faint smile flicker on Peter's lips, but when Scott turned to face him, Peter's face was unreadable. But Scott wasn't done. To everyone's surprise, he reached across Mr. Moffat's desk and boldly grabbed his phone. Not even password protected, he muttered, scrolling through Mr. Moffat's text message function. Nothing was registered. Where are all your texts? Scott demanded loudly. I had worked with Mr. Moffat long enough to know that he was becoming increasingly angry. I don't text. If I want to contact someone, I call. Scott looked around accusingly. Someone sent me a text message about my promotion, and now they've erased the evidence on my phone and yours. He stared at Peter, then turned his head in my direction. I quickly hid behind the door. Young man, Mr. Moffat said loudly, it's not important. We're holding this meeting because I want to know what happened in the guest pavilion last night. Could you explain? There's really nothing to explain, Scott responded quickly. After being fooled into thinking I had been promoted, my team and I celebrated a little. That's all. This wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been the victim of a cruel joke. I understand, said Mr. Moffat with some menace in his voice. Then he looked up. Miss Martin, could you help me, please? When I approached him, he pointed to his computer. Can you set up this damn device so we can look at some of the photos they emailed me? I quickly went to the keyboard and expanded the window to full screen. Everything is ready, I assured him. Great, he said. Now please check my email for an email from Lucas Masterson. When I did, he looked at Scott and Peter. Do you know the name Lucas Masterson? Scott quickly replied, of course. Lucas Masterson is the president of Masterson Industries, our largest client. Excellent, said Mr. Moffat with disdain, and you would agree that we should always impress Mr. Masterson with our professionalism and competence? Of course, Scott said, looking puzzled. Mr. Moffat's tone was now low and menacing. Late last night, Lucas called me because he is an old friend of mine. He wanted to know if this expo was typical of the behavior we condone at Magnadin. When I expressed my confusion, he sent me an email with some photos that he took when he was looking for someone from Magnadin to answer his questions. Miss Martin, could you show these photos to us? Hesitantly, I clicked to start the slideshow. The first image showed a group of people from our company's sales department gathered near the bar in the guest pavilion. People seemed to be serving themselves with alcohol. The next slide showed Scott standing on a small stage set up next to the bar. He drank straight from the bottle and led people around under the stage. I noticed that behind the stage there was a banner with the Magnadin name and logo. The company's logo, said to have been personally designed by Mr. Moffat, was an upraised hand with the index finger forming the number 1 sign. I knew Mr. Moffat wouldn't be happy to see it in the photograph, but the next photo was worse. Now there were 2 young women on stage with Scott, and he hugged them both. I looked at Peter and asked with my lips, "Who are they?" He shrugged in ignorance. The next photo showed Scott dancing with 2 women on stage. Judging by their appearance, all 3 were quite drunk. This impression was reinforced by the fact that the 2 women appeared to be performing a striptease to Scott's delight. There was a collective gasp in the room as the next photo appeared on the screen. One of the girls had lost all her clothes. "Turn it off!" Mr. Moffat shouted, and I quickly turned off the monitor to hide the offending image. "Mr. Benson, not only did you disgrace yourself last night, but you also brought disgrace to Magnadin Industries," he said loudly. Scott's face turned red, and he shouted angrily, "Wait a minute. I'm the victim here. None of this would have happened if I hadn't been tricked into believing I got a promotion." "Thank God you weren't promoted," roared Mr. Moffat. Then he calmed down a little. "I don't care why you did what you did. The fact remains that your behavior was completely unacceptable. Even if the head of our best client had not caught you in the act of debauchery, you still set a terrible example for your employees." He turned sharply to me. "Martin, call HR and security here. Have them escort Mr. Benson back to his office and tell him he has 15 minutes to retrieve his personal items. Effective immediately, Mr. Benson's employment with Magnadin is terminated for cause." "Yes, sir," I barely managed to squeeze out and hurried to make the calls. Behind me, I heard Scott shout, "It's all your fault, Hamill. You set me up." But before he could do or say anything else, one of the security officers walked up and began to escort Scott out. As they waited for the elevator, Peter walked out of Mr. Moffat's office and approached Scott. I was in the hallway just in time to hear Peter whisper to Scott, "You slept with my wife. Now you're reaping the benefits." Scott growled like an animal, but the guard quickly stepped between them. The elevator arrived with the head of HR, so the 3 of them got in and left, leaving Peter and me alone. As I turned to go back to the office, Peter said quietly, "When you get a chance, please come see me. I need to talk about all this." I assured him that I would and then hurried back to Mr. Moffat's door. "Is there anything I can do to help you, Mr. Moffat?" I asked. He raised his head, looking at me with tired eyes, and I realized that everything that was happening had a great impact on him. "Yes, there are actually 3 things that I need, Miss Martin. First of all, please accept my apologies for having to see these lewd photographs. At least I managed to stop it before the worst shots." I smiled and nodded, expressing my gratitude for his delicacy. "The second thing you could do is try to reach Lucas Masterson so I can apologize to him again and let him know what steps I took this morning to ensure this doesn't happen again." I started to walk back to my desk, but he stopped me. "And after you contact Lucas, could you please delete these damn photos from my computer and phone? I don't want to see them anymore." I nodded and took his phone to my desk. As I did this, he looked at me with a penetrating gaze. "I don't know who made Scott believe he was promoted," he said, and my heart began to pound in my chest, "but I think I owe him or her a debt of gratitude for helping me discover Scott's true nature." I couldn't tell for sure, but I thought I saw the slightest smile on his face before he returned to his normal behavior. "And now about that call to Lucas," he said, and I hurried to my desk. When lunch arrived, news of Scott's firing spread throughout the building, and stories about what caused it were everywhere. I tried to avoid any conversation on this topic. I felt like I was too close to it all and didn't want there to be any more guesswork about my role than there already was. But I made a point to go to Peter's office. I wanted to tell him what Mr. Moffat had told me because I thought it might give Peter some comfort that there wouldn't be another shoe about to drop. I expected him to be very relieved, but after I finished, I could still see the tiredness on his face, and it bothered me. However, I asked him the question that had been bothering me since I saw the incriminating slideshow this morning. Peter, who are the two women with Scott? He smiled at me. I'm not sure about the exact details, but I suspect they were free birds, he said. Seeing my confusion, he continued, at almost every show, we have these. These are people who sneak into the show looking for free food, free alcohol, and a free party in the guest rooms. And if the conditions are right, they may also be in the mood for a little free intimate. You never. I started, but he immediately interrupted me. Never, he said firmly. First of all, only a fool would risk being exposed to any diseases they might have. Secondly, I am a faithful husband. He suddenly fell silent, and his face took on a bitter expression. I felt sorry for him. So, where are you going to tell her everything? I asked carefully. When I get home from work today, he said tiredly. I'm working with a lawyer and plan to personally serve C with the paperwork this evening. I'm so sorry, Peter, I said quietly. I was so caught up in this mess with Scott that I almost forgot about her. Then a thought came to mind. Peter, I don't know if this will help, but I haven't deleted those photos Lucas Masterson took yet. Would you like me to print a copy for you? He thought for a moment and then nodded. Yes, please. I'd like to show Sue what kind of person she chose over me, he said darkly. When I returned to his office to give him the printouts I had made, he was getting ready to leave. I want to be home when she arrives, he told me. Besides, I might as well get out of here. I'm not worth a penny until I figure this out. I understand, I told him. But if you want to talk about it later, I'll be here. Thank you, he said. I would like that. You're really the only one who knows what's going on. That evening, Marge invited me out for drinks, but I declined. I was exhausted from the drama that had unfolded that morning, and now I was worried about Peter. I couldn't take my mind off the confrontation ahead of him, and I knew I'd be bad company for Marge. For the second night in a row, I didn't sleep well and again went to work early in the morning in the hope of seeing Peter. I was waiting outside his office when he arrived and thanked me for the cup of coffee I brought him. As we sat on the couch and chair in his office, I couldn't wait any longer. How did it go with C? I asked. Pretty much as expected, he said and began to tell the whole story. I was waiting at the kitchen table when C got home from work. She was surprised to see me. I usually get home much later than her. Anyway, she came and sat across from me and asked what was going on. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer, so I handed her the envelope. What is this? She asked, but I just told her to see for herself. She opened the envelope and started looking at the screenshots I took of your video on Scott's porch. When she saw the first photo, she wasn't sure what she was seeing, but when she turned to the next photo, she screamed in shock. She then hurriedly flipped through the rest of the set before looking at me. Her face turned red, and I wondered if she was more upset about what she had done or about getting caught. Peter, I know what I did was wrong, but it was just a one-time mistake. You were so busy at work, and it had been so long since we made love that when Scott started flirting with me, I just couldn't resist. I shook my head in disgust. That's not true, and you know it, see. This wasn't just one moment of weakness, this was an ongoing relationship. No, I swear it was the only time, she insisted. Instead of arguing with her, I took out my cell phone and started playing the video I copied from your phone. The look on her face was priceless as it went from discomfort to defensiveness to outright anger as she was forced to watch her antics on the small screen. But when the audio track started playing her taunts, she was embarrassed enough to scream, "Turn it off, damn it." I let it play a little longer, then stopped it. Okay, now you know about us. And I'm guessing the other envelope contains divorce papers? She asked coldly. I pushed it across the table toward her, and she quickly flipped through the pages. I thought she would be shocked, but she seemed pretty unperturbed by being served. It doesn't matter, she said. I was planning on filing for divorce myself as soon as Scott got his big promotion at work. So you ruined our marriage because you wanted the money and prestige of marrying a big executive? I asked bitterly. Look, Peter, let's be real. You worked all those long hours and ignored me, by the way. But let's face it, you weren't getting anywhere. This really made me angry. I worked all those long hours to create a better life for both of us, I said heatedly. I thought that's what you wanted. She gave me a patronizing smile. I thought that for a long time, but while I was remodeling Scott's house, he gave me the real truth about you and your career. You're just marking your time at Magnet while he's about to take a big leap. In that video, it seemed to me that you were more interested in night with him than in his career path, I said angrily. She blushed. Maybe I like both better than what you have to offer, she replied sharply. Suddenly, I felt old and tired. I rubbed my face. So are you and Scott planning on getting married as soon as our divorce is finalized and he gets that big promotion? I asked. Exactly, she said. What if I told you that Scott won't get that big promotion at all? She looked at me with a calculating look. I'd say you're a pathetic, clumsy liar. What if I told you that Scott was fired for inappropriate behavior from Magnet this morning? I asked. I saw fear cross her eyes, but she quickly recovered. It's impossible, she said loudly. He does a great job, and his sales team sets records. It's impossible for them to do without him. I think I have a sadistic streak because I enjoyed it. I took another envelope from my jacket pocket. What is this? She demanded. Just some scandalous pictures of your boyfriend at the Vegas Expo this week, I said. You better study them carefully because I can assure you that Mr. Bar Moffat was very interested when he saw them this morning. I opened the envelope and showed her the first photo. She relaxed a little. No one is going to complain about a sales director having a little fun after a successful trade show, she said. She didn't comment on the second photo either, but I noticed that she was becoming increasingly worried. When I turned the next photo over, she sighed. Who are those two girls with Scott? She asked with jealousy. No idea, I said. I've never seen them before, but Scott seems very familiar with them, I added and turned the next photo over. She didn't say anything, but her face darkened when she saw further photographs. How could he cheat on me like that? She sobbed. How could he humiliate me in front of all these people? The irony of her reaction left me speechless. After some time, she raised her head and looked at me through red eyes. Is this true? She asked. Really? I asked sharply. Scott told me you slept with your boss's secretary. Is this what started it all? Did you start a relationship with Scott to get back at me? I saw her. She's so beautiful that I thought you wouldn't be able to resist her. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but not everyone has the same morals as you and Scott. For your information, I have always been 100% loyal to you. I stared at her and shook my head in disgust. I can't believe you believe the words of a salesman. Her head dropped, and she began to cry bitterly. I got up from the table, grabbed my keys, and went out to get dinner. When I returned, I found that C had packed her personal belongings and left. I was very sad listening to him. That must have been terrible for you, Peter, I said when he finished. How are you feeling now? Honestly, he said quietly, my feelings are mixed up. I feel a lot of bitterness towards C for cheating on me, but I can't help but feel regret and sadness that my marriage is over. I'm glad Scott got what he deserved, but I'm exhausted from the whole experience. Most of all, I just feel tired. I know it's bad, Peter, but I promise you it will get better, I said. Although management was careful not to spread the circumstances that led to Scott's dishonorable dismissal, too many people knew at least some of the facts, and the story became the #1 gossip item for the next few weeks. Ironically, it was Scott's old team who were most eager to spill the beans, perhaps as revenge for the way he treated them as a boss. Members of Peter's team generally maintained confidentiality, but it was clear that they were happy with the outcome. Unfortunately, the implication about the role Scott played in Peter and C's divorce also became common gossip in the hallways. No one asked Peter directly, but as soon as he left the room, secret comments and hushed conversations began. I felt sad for him, but there was nothing I could do to protect him. Knowing as much as I knew, I could only remain silent about the whole matter. I tried to keep in touch with Peter as often as possible to make sure he was okay. I looked for excuses to stop by his office during the day or have lunch at the same table as his team. Sometimes, Marge would come over and take me to her favorite pub after work. Given her position as the CEO's assistant, I expected that she probably knew almost as much about what happened as I did, but she never broached the topic in our little get-togethers. She was always interested in how Peter was doing, and I tried to keep her informed of what I saw and noticed. She also constantly asked how I was doing, which seemed strange since I was only indirectly involved, but she always asked, and I always assured her that I was fine. About 4 months after these events, I received a call one afternoon from Debbie, the woman who operated the control panel for Peter during the expo. She told me that Peter's team was throwing a little surprise party for him after work and wanted to know if I would like to join. When I asked what the occasion was, she told me that Peter's divorce had just been finalized. Of course, I told her I'd be there. The celebration took place in a private room of the bar, which was often visited by marketing employees. When I arrived, the room was decorated with silly banners that said things like "Freedom at last," "Peter's back in the market," and "Beware, ladies." I thought it was quite childish and tasteless, but everyone else seemed to think otherwise. The noise level was high, thanks in part to several barrels of beer that were quickly emptied by the crowd. I thought it was nice that his team thought so highly of Peter, but when I saw him in the crowd, I didn't think he was enjoying the celebration as much as the others. Someone tried to force him to make a speech, and after futile attempts at resistance, he climbed onto the table. But instead of making humorous remarks, he kept everything short and to the point. After thanking everyone for the party and again paying tribute to their efforts at the expo, he invited them all to continue having fun. He then quickly jumped back into the crowd. As soon as the fun resumed, I quickly walked over to him, and we sat down at an empty table. "Thanks for coming, Jess," he said. "How did you like the party?" I looked closely at his face and saw that the wrinkles around his eyes were still there. "More importantly, how are you, Peter?" I asked. The joyful expression that he tried to maintain disappeared, and I clearly saw how unhappy he was. I know I should be all supportive and excited about being single again, but to be honest, I feel depressed right now, and I'm not even sure why. I think I can tell you because that's exactly how I felt after divorcing my husband. My view is that you're sad about the loss of your marriage. But it doesn't make sense, Jess. I don't want to be married to C anymore. After what she did and how she treated me, I can never trust her again, he said firmly. Of course not, I said soothingly. But you're grieving over something else. Perhaps you always imagined being in a committed relationship. Perhaps at some point, you wanted to have a family. C ruined all of that. No wonder you're feeling depressed. You've lost the picture of what your life could have been. He looked at me carefully for a moment and then nodded slowly. There's a lot of truth in that, Jess. He looked at me again. Thank you for being such a good friend. At this moment, several of his colleagues came over and pulled his arm. It won't do to have too much seriousness, too much sobriety. Come on, Peter. With that, they dragged him away, but as he left, he smiled and waved at me. I soon left and headed home. This kind of party is not my style, but I was happy to help Peter, and I smiled all the way home. Now that his divorce was over, I expected Peter to revive and come out of his depression. In some respects, it was clear that he was on the road to recovery, but somehow this did not lead to changes in the way he behaved, at least with me. He waved and smiled when he saw me, and we still seemed on the same page when we talked, but I continued to look for something more, which I never found. A week or two later, Mr. Moffat called me into his office. After asking me to close the door, he motioned for me to sit down. "Please keep what I am about to say a secret, Miss Martin," he said. "Do you remember the executive committee meeting that took place during the expo?" "In fact, I do. I told the committee that I was planning to resign, but after I found out about the mess with Scott Benson, the committee asked me to stay and try to fix the mess he created. But now everything is going smoothly enough that I am going to continue with my retirement plans. I'll make an announcement after lunch today, but I wanted to give you advance notice so you won't be caught off guard." I was shocked by his news, but grateful for his attention to me. "The other thing you need to know," he continued, "is that you will have a new boss, Peter Hamill. I hope this news makes you happy." "Oh, Mr. Moffat, I'm so happy for Peter, but you've been so wonderful as a boss that I'm really going to miss you." With that, I stood up and walked around his desk to hug him. He smiled at me and said some very nice compliments, then he asked me to call Peter to his office. When they finished their meeting and Peter left, I rushed to congratulate him on his well-deserved promotion. "Thank you, Jess," he said warmly. "It really means a lot to me." When he left the office, his warmth stayed with me for a while, but then the feeling began to fade as I started thinking more deeply about everything. By evening, I was depressed. At the end of the workday, Marge stopped by and asked me to join her at the tavern after work. "Marge, I have things to do at home," I told her, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. I think part of what makes her so valuable to a CEO is that when she wants something, she is absolutely persistent. In the end, I gave up. As we sat down in the tavern, she leaned across the table and looked at me intently. "Okay, Jess, let's find out everything. What's bothering you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I waved her off. "Bullshit," she said, which shocked me because Marge almost never swears. "You've been walking around for the last few weeks looking like a little girl with a sick dog, and today you're acting like your dog is dead. I thought you were supposed to be excited about working with Peter. Tell me what's wrong." I tried to resist, but suddenly something inside me broke, and I began to wipe away my tears, trying to express my feelings in words. "Peter's promotion is the last straw, Marge. I just don't think I can see him every day and be that close to him." "I don't understand, Jess." "Why not?" I sobbed. I know his wife cheated on him and their divorce was difficult for him, but once the divorce was finalized, I thought he would relax around me. Maybe want to meet me or go somewhere with me, but every time I see him, he still treats me like a friend, like one of the team. It kills me." She looked at me with sympathy. "You really miss him a lot, don't you? You always loved him so much." "No," I objected. "I didn't have feelings for him while he was married. Of course, I respected him and I liked working with him, but it was purely professional. I would never allow myself to have feelings for a married man, for someone who wasn't interested that way." "You sure managed to spend a lot of time with him," she noted dryly. "But I had to," I said. "He was a key part of Mr. Moffat's team." "Ah, sure," Marge said sarcastically. "But after you saw his wife with Scott, your attitude towards him began to change." "How did you know that?" I exclaimed. Marge just grinned at me, then her face became serious again. "So, you thought you and Peter were in a relationship, and you were hoping it would develop into something more, right?" "Probably," I admitted quietly. She was silent for a minute and then said, "You know, you really are like a blonde." "Wait a minute, Marge," I said angrily. "You may be my friend, but you have no right to talk to me like that." She folded her arms and leaned across the table. "I stand by what I said. You're acting like a blonde. Now shut up and listen to me for a minute. I think half the people at Magneton know about your big crush on Peter Hamill, but what have you ever done to show him how you feel?" "I've done a lot," I objected, offended. "I visited him at every opportunity. I tried to have lunch with his team when he was in the cafeteria." "Isn't that what you did when he was married?" Marge interrupted. "Well, yes," I admitted, "but not that often," I added weakly. "So, how was he supposed to know your feelings had changed if your actions didn't show it?" she asked. Before I could answer, she asked another question. "Have you ever even touched him?" "No," I sighed. "I would never do that. I mean touch him on the arm or shoulder, something to create a physical connection." "I'm sure I have," I answered evasively, but in fact, I couldn't remember a single time when this happened. "You're afraid to touch men for fear they'll take it the wrong way, aren't you?" "Maybe a little," I admitted. She continued to look at me. Suddenly, she asked rhetorically, "You know what's the problem with you, Jess?" "The problem is that you're too pretty." I opened my mouth to answer, but Marge interrupted me. "All your life, you could rely on your beauty. You never had to worry about finding men, they always came out of the woodwork for you. I bet your first husband found you, not the other way around." I looked down at the table. "Well, maybe the first time we met, he approached me at a party in college." "Exactly," said Marge. "You're used to being passive, waiting for a guy to make the first move. If he doesn't pass the test, you brush him off and then sit back and wait for the next one to come along. But that's not all. The fact is that you use your beauty as a shield to keep men at a distance, even the ones you might actually like." "But And the reason you do this is not because you are arrogant or selfish, but because you are afraid. You are afraid to take risks, afraid to expose yourself because you might make the wrong choice. So, you hide behind your beauty, hoping that Mr. Right will eventually find you and break through your protective walls. I was speechless, but Marge wasn't finished. And I'll bet that the reason you're afraid is because the one man you chose, the one you thought was Mr. Right, turned out to be the biggest mistake of your life. Ever since then, you've been afraid to step out of your comfort zone and take risks again. So even though part of you desperately wants to try and build a relationship with Peter, another part of you is telling you to stay away and wait. You're just hanging around aimlessly, hoping he'll overcome your barriers and start courting you. I couldn't look up at her. She came across the table to me, hugged me, and kissed me on the cheek. Think about what I said, Jess. See if there's some truth to it. Then she left. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, thinking about Marge's words. Some of them were painful and not entirely true, but I had to admit that she was right about many things. Finally, sometime in the early morning hours, I made a decision. Even then, I only slept restlessly. As soon as I got to work, I made a phone call and then went to implement my plan. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing, but at least I wasn't being passive. Shortly after I returned to my desk, Peter came over to meet Mr. Moffat again. They discussed marketing plans for a long time, but finally, the session ended. As he was leaving, Peter stopped by my desk and said, "I'm really looking forward to working more closely with you, Jess." I took a deep breath and stood up. "Peter, I met with HR this morning and agreed on a transfer. I'll start working in a different department in 2 weeks." He stepped back as if I had slapped him in the face. "But why, Jess? Did I offend you in some way?" From the corner of my eye, I noticed Mr. Moffat standing in the doorway of his office, looking worried. I focused on Peter. "No, Peter, you didn't do anything. It's me. Over the past few months, I've developed strong feelings for you, but the company strictly prohibits relationships between employees and their bosses. Since I intend to give them a go, I can't work for you." Over Peter's shoulder, I noticed Marge peeking around the corner, but I continued to stare at Peter, holding my breath as I waited for his response. He looked at me in surprise. "But you never said or did anything," he said. I glanced at Marge. "I know," I said, "but I'm talking now." Peter didn't say anything, and time seemed to slow down. Then, standing in front of me with his heart pounding in his chest, he suddenly stepped forward and grabbed me by the shoulders. "Given the circumstances, I think we can do without the usual 2 weeks' notice," he said, and kissed me with such passion and promise that I could barely hear the applause coming from Marge and Mr. Moffat. What do you think of our story today? The main character's wife is definitely to blame in this story, because she cheated on him behind her husband's back. What's your opinion? Write in the comments. Until new videos.